Well, it's a pleasure to be here. It's my first time, so it's even if I'm not right at the beginning of my career, it's still time to come to Washington and start working seriously with people who count. It's also a pleasure to speak in the frame of this wonderful exhibition and about a topic which, as you will see, is very indebted with the Turkish and Islamic Art Museum in Istanbul, where I've been working, as some of you know, for many years, and where some of the keys I was looking for this study of the first scripts were actually waiting for me. Well, the title is a little bit an allusion to Qur'anic material. Of course, Astâr al-awwâlîn has another meaning, but I wanted here to allude to this relationship between the lines and the first one who used these scripts. Well, we will start. Yes, you. According to our sources, a manuscript known as the Quran of Osman, it's not this one, was already venerated in Damascus by the end of the 12th century, although Malik ibn Anas told at the second half of the 8th century that the true Quran had disappeared. Even if we don't know what was the manuscript of Damascus, we have a lot of manuscripts, like the one which is nowadays in the Turkish and Islamic Art Museum in Istanbul, showing that for people, any old-looking manuscript written on parchment would be a Quran of Usman. And even if this one or that one may be different as far as the scripts are concerned, the point is that people completely forgot the scripts of the early period and had no idea of what was the script used in Osman's time. Actually, with the exception of An-Nadim in his Fihrist, written in the 10th century, the history of the early scripts was reduced almost to the Kufic. This loss of knowledge about early Islam was not only the case of the scripts. At about the same time, in the highly technical field of the rasm science, that is to say, the knowledge of the written text of the Quran, we also observe a loss of information about the earliest stage of the handwritten transmission of the Quran, the Quranic text. On the other hand, legal concerns about the fate of the worn-out manuscripts of the Quran led to the preservation of these early witnesses in Geniza-like storage places located in the heart of various cities in their great mosque. This legal frame, known through a treatise from Ottoman time, is certainly rooted into earlier views and explains why 4 such structures have been reported, containing hundreds of manuscripts or fragments of manuscripts with a wealth of material that allows us to get an increasingly precise view of the beginning of the Quranic handwritten transmission. I shall concentrate here on the Umayyad and early Abbasid times. As this event is in good part devoted to the collection in the Turkish and Islamic Art Museum in Istanbul, I shall begin with the deposit that was once kept in the Umayyad Mosque in Damascus and is now housed in the Turkish and Islamic Art Museum. But, of course, it's not alone. There was also a deposit in Fustat, Old Cairo, and another one which was discovered by the end of the 19th century in Kairouan, and finally the most recent one in Sana'a, discovered at the beginning of the 70s. The material is slightly different in Sana'a, as most of the material is still kept in situ for the time being. We don't know what is the fate of the collection, but hopefully it remains where it is. It's not the case for the 3 other deposits, since the fragments were bought by bibliophile, Muslim or Western, and the fragments of the original manuscripts are now scattered among various collections. So this makes a problem, and we need a good typology of the scripts in order to bring again together folios that were once part of the same manuscripts. The evidence is unfortunately still not completely available. With the exception of Fustat, which is rather well catalogued, the manuscripts in Damascus, Kairouan, and Sana'a are still only known in a very partial way. Anyhow, the fact is that we have a huge amount of documents, which means that series can be established with some certainty in order to produce typologies for the script, the illumination, or the codicology. The word I used, Geniza, is slightly misleading since it conjures the image of the Cairo Geniza with its enormous collection of archival material. Indeed, the four deposits are almost exclusively libraries, more precisely Quranic libraries. It is somewhat difficult to grasp the very specific nature of this collection. A comparison may prove useful. The Bibliothèque Nationale de France houses, as you know, a large collection of Quranic fragments, not only as far as the number of leaves is concerned, but also because they document the presence of 250 copies of the Quran in Fustat. Since the middle of the 19th century, these 250 fragmentary copies of the Quran from the 7th to 10th centuries are kept not very far from the rich collection of Carolingian manuscripts of the same library that are almost contemporaneous with the Quranic copies from Fustat. If we make a survey of the Carolingian Bibles and New Testaments in the Bibliothèque Nationale, we find a total of 70 copies collected from various places, a striking imbalance if we remember that the Quranic manuscripts come from the same deposit, that of Fustat. And if we compare the Fustat deposit with the Carolingian library that remained more or less intact, that of St. Gallen in Switzerland, the difference is still more pronounced with 39 manuscripts with biblical contents, but only one, the one on the screen, with both the Bible and the New Testament. This observation leaves, of course, aside issues that, like the use of the manuscript, the patronage, and so on, which I won't address. I just speak here of sheer numbers. Some sources provide information, but their scope is reduced since they focus on certain items or list names that cannot be clearly related to the material evidence. We have, for instance, names for the various styles of scripts, but without a sample to match the description, with one very famous exception. We have name of copies for the first 3 or 4 centuries, but no colophon, that is to say a statement at the end of the manuscript, providing the name of the copyist until the 10th century, at least for the moment. Paleography is supposed to answer the question of the date and place of origin of a manuscript that does not contain any direct evidence about both. On the first point, some progress has been made since some of the series elaborated on the basis of this material happen to include data that can provide more or less an answer as for the date. And the reliance on C14 analysis over the last decade, even if they cannot claim to be the final answer, helps us in roughly arranging the material in a sequence. The geography of the early Quranic manuscript production still eludes us. The evidence known so far is irregularly distributed, most of the material with an established provenance. In this case, I only want to designate the 4 great collections, being concentrated in an area west of Baghdad. Only recently, the development of research in Iran has shown that the belief I held personally that nothing was to be expected from that area has been proved wrong, with some early manuscripts of very great interest. Of course, the place of conservation, once again, cannot be equated with the place of production unless there is some good argument in that direction. The various materials said to have been used for the recording of the revelations during Muhammad's lifetime never were meant to be a book, And if we accept the traditional account of the events, when the decision was made to produce the final record, or records, since as shown by the palimpsest from Sana, various compilations were produced by the middle of the 7th century, the most common form or shape of book at that time in the Eastern Mediterranean, the Codex, became the support for the Quranic text. This, of course, implied some contacts with people familiar with the techniques associated with it, both for the copy and for the construction of the book. And it is no wonder that the expression bayn al-lawhayn, an obvious reference to the bindings using wooden boards, like the one on the screen, became a way of designating the contents of the mushaf, that is to say, the copy of the Quran. That Christians were involved in the transcription of the Quranic copies is actually well known through Muslim sources dealing with an issue I shall address later. The early scripts that we designate with the name of Hijazi, a reference to the region in northwestern Arabia where Mecca and Medina are located, but this does not mean, once again, that they were exclusively used in that specific area, reflect a stage of development where individual hands and practices were not perceived as a problem. In the case of one of the various manuscripts produced by a team of copyists, the one appearing on the screen, 5 hands are clearly recognizable, not only for the shape of the letters or for the orthography, but also for the writing implements each of them used. When we try to estimate the number of copies that have been preserved from that stage of Quran production, this is actually a problem. I mean, the teamwork, since 2 fragments with 2 clearly different versions of this script may have been part of the same manuscript. That is to say that if they are, in the case of this manuscript, which is kept in 4 locations, we can reconstruct it because we have instances of a script on the recto and another one on the verso, so it's obvious that they are going together. But in some cases, the script may appear on 2 separate leaves, and so you will never know. Of course, the size of the leaves will be more or less the same, but you will not be able to prove it because in many instances, they are just fragments, so it's not a continuous text. And so we are perhaps estimating too high the number of Hijazi fragments, but there is no way of knowing what's really happened. So when we try to estimate, in spite of a close relationship with the scripts found on papyri, the Quranic text may have been subjected to a mise en ligne, that is to say, a way of writing on the line, differing from that found in the documents, like the one, very famous, the earliest one, found on papyri, the book hands following the rules of the late antique scriptio continua, adapted to the Arabic script, namely the fact to have the same spacing between the letters and groups of letters, irrespective of the words, and cutting words at the end of a line, a thing which is not allowed by later Arabic tradition. An early date for this manuscript in the second half of the 7th century is supported by C14 datings that have anyhow to be read with caution, and there are, well, the Tübingen manuscript and later the Birmingham fragment have made the headlines, but we have to be very careful with these datings. These copies, however, do not seem to have been fully satisfying for at least part of the community, since the production of a new kind of mushaf began in the last decades of the 7th century. 2 illuminated copies, one found in the Fustat deposit, the second one among the Damascus manuscripts preserved in Istanbul, provide some clues about the date when they were produced. The illumination contains clear Umayyad elements as well as details also known from mosaics from the 7th and early 8th century found in churches excavated in Jordan. The script itself shares various features with the inscription of Abd al-Malik. who reigned between 685 and 705. In addition to these two manuscripts, the same script is also found on other copies, a dramatic change in comparison with the previous stage of Quranic copies production. Here I've taken 3 examples from the Turkish and Islamic Art Museum showing that the script was repeated by various copists, which is a big difference with the previous stage, and that it was used as well on vertical and horizontal formats, which is also very important for the chronology of this change. We had now better arguments to think that it was already in use by the end of the 7th century, earlier than what I thought previously. So the script is found on various manuscripts. The similitude is not only a matter of letter shapes or mise en page, it also has to do with the line module the various copists have been using. The largest copies have 25 lines to the page, like the Fustat Codex. However, other copies have a lesser number of lines, some of them only 16, which could point to multi-volume sets. In spite of this diversity, the module for all those scripts remain fairly constant. In all cases, with only 2 exceptions, the lines measure between 10 and 12.7 millimeters in 8. Interestingly enough, the size of the manuscripts has no bearing at all on the script module. In the largest one, a line is 12.7 millimeter high, very close to that of another manuscript, although the latter is written on a substantially smaller folios with 16 lines to the page. The various manuscripts are not the work of the same copyist, once again, since some peculiarities suggest that they were produced by various scribes. But these men shared a common repertory and used, and this is also important, similar tools for writing. The paleographically homogeneous group of manuscripts provide a fresh view of the changes with which the Arabic script and the Mus'haf underwent by the end of the 7th and beginning of the 8th centuries. 2 aspects seem especially important. The first one is that the work was undertaken by anonymous script designers, if I may say so, who submitted the Arabic script to a complete revamp, and the second one is the diffusion of the results among the copists. This may imply that the Umayyad elite played a role in the diffusion of this script, or even exerted some form of control over the whole process of book production. The references common to those who transcribe these mushafs suggest that some sort of teaching or training had been set up for copists or calligraphers. The consistent size and mise en page of the largest copies can be the result of an official patronage, which the sources actually mention. However, the diversity of the fragments preserved, ranging from the elegant Fustat Codex to more common copies, indicates that this style had some success and that its diffusion was not restricted to the elite or to official patronage. The production of Quranic manuscript did not fail to draw the attention of legal scholars, since the sacred book of Islam had to comply with the law. At the beginning, people probably avoided components that most obviously should not have been used in a context of production by non-Muslims who may have been working according to their own tradition. Ink recipes involving wine, for example, were probably discarded, but other points also required some attention. An important issue for the economy of the book was the question of the fees paid to the copists. The information we have about the involvement of Christian copists is actually part of this discussion. Unfortunately, we do not know what kind of copy was involved. In addition, we should not forget that the discussion may have been part of an argument against the sums paid by the Umayyads for some copies, a point echoed in the account preserved by Al-Nadim about the pious Umar II turning down, because of its price, a copy written in gold letters he commissioned to a calligrapher. The materials were also a subject to discussion. In the second half of the 8th century, Malik ibn Anas stated that gold should be avoided, but saw no objection to the use of silver for the illumination. In the material, there is almost no trace of this, but this may be due to the technical problems connected with the use of silver. On the other hand, gold was present on some Umayyad manuscripts I was discussing previously. It disappeared from the later Umayyad and early Abbasid production, then became quite prominent in the 9th century. Silver is also known to have been used for the bindings as well as textile. Unfortunately, the bindings that survive seem all to be later and are all covered with leather. Malik also condemned the change of the orthography, the use of the points indicating the short vowels, and the multi-volume sets. These concerns are in part later than the manuscripts discussed now, but they probably are the echo of discussion that started at an earlier date. Actually, another script also found on various manuscripts might be contemporaneous with the previous one, but circulating in other circles. It can be related to the later development of the Hijazi-style Mus'haf, although it shares some feature with the more glamorous script found on the Fustat and Damascus copies and the group of copies related to it. Both manuscripts are important for the information they provide about the date and the chronological implication they entail. They also show a dramatic change in the conception of the Mus'haf, reflecting the control over the text the Umayyads were trying to implement. The diffusion of a regularized version of the early script, closely related to that of official inscription, coincided with the emergence of a new concern, that of a book reflecting through its beauty the importance of the perfection of the text, the perfection and importance of the text. This change is meaningful as it reveals the aspirations of a more sophisticated community, at least in some circle, well aware of their cultural environment. The reasons behind this new concern can be sought in a general tendency which has been described in the following terms by Barry Flood about the architectural realization of the Umayyads in Damascus. The desire to rival the best efforts of the Christians and the need to convince by appearance were adequately addressed by the construction of a monumental ensemble which was not only worthy of an imperial capital, but strongly redolent of that most familiar by sight or reputation to the Syrian subjects of the Umayyads. In the field of manuscript production, the new Mus'haf was challenging the Christian luxury Bibles by its appearance. It's also conveyed visually the idea that the text transcribed in the same script was identical from one copy to the other. An aesthetic and ideologically motivated change based on material choices, the script, the calamus adapted to the script, the presentation, and in some cases the illumination, had successfully taken place. The desire to rival the best effort of the Christians may have been also responsible for another development, that of folio volumes with 20 lines of text to the page, best illustrated by the Umayyad Mus'haf of Sana'a, dated to the beginning of the 8th century. The copy was probably completed by the end of Al-Walid's reign between 710 and 715, a dating supported by a C14 analysis of the parchment, providing a date between 657 and 690. As you see, there is a discrepancy between the final results of the C14 analysis and my own view of the date of the manuscript. The parallels which can be established between that copy of and the manuscript now in Dublin point to their contemporaneity. Both are folio copies, produced, that is to say, using by folio a full sheet of parchment, produced on the basis of the same scribe structure, with a script considerably thicker than that of the Umayyad Codex of Fustat, for instance. Both show a tendency to accentuate the width of the letter, but relied for the execution on a tool with a larger tip in order to adapt the script to a larger page, but also to produce volumes that would not look too thin. If you write in a thin script, you put more words, and of course there are less folios. But if you expand the script, then you get a three-dimension volume of some importance. The thickness of the stroke means that a technical evolution had taken place. It was not only a matter of cutting a thicker nib, it probably involved a change of tool or of material, as well as a change in the movements and position of the copyist. This evolution is all the more striking in that it seems somewhat sudden, and no comparable tool seems to have been known in other manuscripts tradition in this area. Both the Sana copy and the Dublin manuscripts were produced during the first decades of the 8th century under Umayyad rule and probably in some official context. The cost of these copies had risen dramatically when compared with former mushafs like the Fustat Codex. Here it's a kind of presentation of the amount in square meters of parchment required for the first, in green, it's the manuscript with 5 copies, that is to say, the earliest part of the production, and it's a quarto-size manuscript. Then in yellow, the Fustat Codex, slightly more square meters, 18, and then a kind of jump for the Sana copy with 90 square meters of parchment. Of course, this means an extra cost. The reflection on the appearance of the sacred book had been applied to both the general outer appearance, the mushaf must be a large book, and to the presentation of the text, the mushaf must be a beautiful book. One wonders why such copies were produced. Why all these dramatic changes over a comparatively very short period of time? An obvious reason is apologetic. The folio Bibles of the Middle East were a challenge in terms of visual culture. The increase in the size of the script module helped reaching a significantly higher number of folios, hence a more impressive copy. An account by Malik Ibn Anas suggests that public readings implying the use of a mushaf were instituted in Medina by Al-Hajjaj ibn Yusuf, in other words, under the reign of Abd al-Malik. Were the folio manuscripts part of this rite? Political reasons cannot be discarded. Folio copies of the Qur'an produced under official patronage could be also a powerful support for the Umayyad dynasty. It is no wonder that the idea was taken up again by the Abbasids. A group of 3 plano copies with 12 lines to the page, one in Tashkent, scattered also, one in Cairo, and one in Fustat, Paris, and Gotha. These 3 copies could be the final answer in a kind of escalation in book dimensions. Plano means that they were produced with a leaf being a full leaf of parchment. According to the account I just mentioned from Malik, Al-Mahdi, who reigned between 775 and 785, sent to Medina a big copy of the Quran that superseded the Musaf sent by Al-Hajjaj that was pushed aside in the mosque. In his desire to cancel the traces of the Umayyads, replacing Abd al-Malik's name on the Dome of the Rock's inscription, removing the Ka'ba's veil presented by the Umayyads, he saw the larger copies of the Quran as an effective way to eliminate their symbolic presence in the mosque that received previously the copies of Al-Hajjaj. In addition, the feature of these 3 copies seemed to echo Malik's preoccupation with the text and its presentation. The C14 datings would support such an attribution, with all the reservation one has to do with these results once again. When only about 2,000 hides of sheep were needed for the folio copy of Sana, about 1,000 were necessary for the 12-line copy in Cairo. So many sheep turned into a book. The study of the Bibliothèque Qur'anique of Damascus, Fustat, Cairo, and Sana is only at its beginning, and the results I've shown quickly here are only provisional. They provide a frame for the chronology of the development of the script and the book culture during the first centuries of Islam. As I said, the geography of these developments is still missing, although it seems that the Umayyad script, illustrated by the Fustat and Damascus codices, did not reach the Yemen or the Ifriqiya. And of course, we cannot identify the sociological context behind this and some deviant copies I didn't mention here. We can only make educated guesses about the patrons of the manuscripts of that period. Turning back to the numbers I mentioned at the beginning, the Carolingian and the manuscript and the Qur'an, we also have to reconsider the conclusions of some scholars who insist on the fact that the word kitab in the Qur'an was not meant to refer to an actual book. For the early Muslim communities, it seems quite the contrary, to have been an extremely important thing to have a book, or better, entire libraries with the Qur'an. Thank you.